crowd away. But not only does he send the crowd away, he sends the disciples away as well. The Bible says after he sends them away, he goes to the mountain to pray. Jesus is guarding himself from becoming some celebrity to the people. He does not want to have fame, but he only wants to be faithful to the Father. So in sending the crowd away and sending the disciples away, they end up getting into the boat. And once they are in the boat, they sail and they end up in the middle of the sea. After getting to the middle of the sea, they encounter the winds. The winds are blowing against the ship, and Jesus is on the shore praying. As the wind is blowing against the ship, the disciples are terrified when they see a man walking on the water. They did not recognize who the man was until he spoke to them, and then he shares with them that there is no need for them to be afraid. He gets on the boat, and then the wind stops. But what intrigues me the most is that they've been with Jesus and they cannot recognize him. They've been with Jesus and they are fretting because of the storm. They have been with Jesus, yet they've not learned the value nor the power of who Jesus really is. So it is with us. Many of us, we are just like the disciples. We've seen the Lord work in our lives. We've seen how he has opened doors, how he has provided for us. And the moment a storm shows up in our lives, we start to get terrified of the trouble that's surrounding us. And then when Jesus shows up in our situation, we act as if we don't know who's in the situation with us. So what Jesus does is he now uses the storm to be a training ground for his disciples to help them grow in their relationship with him. So what he does first is he sends them into a situation. Look at the text. If you watch the scriptures carefully, it says immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. This would suggest that they did not get in there by accident. They did not get in there by chance, but they got in there because they were commanded by the master to get into the boat, which says, number one, that they are in the will of God. Beloved, sometimes the Lord sends us into situations that we are not necessarily desiring to go in, but it is for his will. I would rather be in the storm on the sea in the will of God than to be on the shore with no storm at all. I want to say this parenthetically this afternoon. Some of you are in some difficult situations, but understand this: if it is God's will as to where you are in the right place. We see in this not only the will of God, but the work of God. It is God who has not only commanded them to be in this place, but he has willed them to be in this place, and it is his work, which would suggest the sovereignty of God is at work in the lives of the disciples. The same way that God's sovereignty is at work in the life of each one of these disciples, God's sovereignty is at work in our lives. But what we don't like about the sovereignty of God is we don't like when God is in control of things that we have no control of. We want God's will to work when it's working to benefit us, but sometimes God has to will us in some difficult places, and he has to will us to go through the storm, not always for correction, but sometimes God wills the storms of our life for perfection. In essence, God is trying to mature us for ministry. Sometimes God is trying to develop us so that we can be the people of God that he has called us to be. So perhaps you are in a situation right now. Stop fighting against what you're going through and start accepting maybe this is just the will of God for my life. Beloved, when we understand God's sovereignty, that means that God is in control of every situation. God is in control of all of the good and all of the bad that's happening in your life, which simply would suggest it doesn't matter what's going on. It's not outside of God's will. I know that's troubling to some of us and our theology because we don't like the bad stuff that's happening in our life. I didn't say God made it happen. I said, but it's his will that it does happen. And what we see in the text is the disciples have been willed in a place that God has decided and designed for them. What place are you in right now that it is solely by the will and the work of God that you are there? How are you dealing with the situation that God has you in right now? Some of us, we complain about what God is doing in our lives. Sometimes we argue with God with what God is doing in our lives. But I've learned to accept and appreciate when I am on the agenda of the Almighty. Even when it's uncomfortable, I've learned to appreciate and accept when I'm on his agenda, because I couldn't get on his agenda unless he had placed me on his agenda. And if he placed me on his agenda, that means he is setting me up for something that's greater than my understanding. Let's get closer to somebody. You might be in a situation right now that you are pushing yourself back against, saying, Lord, I don't want to be in the storm that I am in right now. But God says, what I tried to teach you in the previous moment of your life, you didn't get the lesson. So what I had to do was I had to sit you down in the midst of this situation, so maybe you can take a retrospective look back and see how I worked in the past, and you will know that the same God that was blessing you in the past is the same God that's able to work out for your blessings in the present. Come here right now. Somebody right now, you're trying to get over it, but watch this. When the Lord sends you to a place, guess what God will also do? He sees you while you're in your situation. Watch the text. It says, when the evening was come, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Watch verse 48. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against him. If the Lord sends you in it, the Lord, he sees what he has already sent you in. See, the thing about God is you can't get around him because he's a God of everywhere, which would simply suggest that the Lord is watching every situation that we are in. He sees, number one, their obstacle.